The Harvard Graduate School of Education, working at the nexus of practice, policy, and research.
We have an extraordinary panel this afternoon, which is going to cover for us the question of why do we educate? What does it mean to be educated in the 21st century, all the way from the K through 12 college, from the K through 12 level to colleges and universities. I will not read the full bios of our speakers because you all have them printed in your programs. We're going to hear from the following in the following order. First, from Henry Rosovsky, who's a professor emeritus at this university, has a distinguished career as an economist, as an academic. He was also a dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and acting president of this university and member of the Harvard Corporation, one of the two governing boards of these universities. And about 20 years ago, in a book, The University and Honors Manual, Henry set out to write a chapter on, so what should be the goals of a college education? And today he's going to talk about what those ideas were and where he's changed his mind in the last 2 decades. Then we're going to hear from Armando Vilaseca, who's going to talk about what accountability does to our K through 12 schools in terms of producing a laser-like focus on certain kinds of competencies, but what that means in terms of the other competencies which are important, the other 21st century skills, social and emotional competencies, which were discussed in the previous panel. We're then going to hear from Deborah Delisle, who has been recently nominated as Assistant Secretary of Elementary and Secondary Education of the U.S. Department of Education, and who was a superintendent, state superintendent of education for Ohio, where she led a number of exemplary reforms, including the production of a state roadmap to advance global competency in that state. We then are going to hear from Larry Bacow, who is currently a president in residence at our university, but who most recently was president of Tufts University, where he's best known for a number of things, but among them his emphasis in interdisciplinary study and in advancing the civic mission of the university. And perhaps he'll talk a little about that because it included advancing the engagement of members of the university community in civic activities, advancing the study of civic education and research and scholarship on civic ed, but also building consortia of universities around the world that would give each other support and encouragement to extend that broader social mission. And we're going to hear, he's not with us right now, but he's going to join us in about half an hour. We will also hear from David Gergen, who's a professor at the Kennedy School and probably best known to many of you as a political commentator in CNN. So without further ado, I'm going to call on Henry. They will each speak for about 15 minutes. Then we're going to hear responses from 2 of our ALI fellows, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Henry?
Ladies and gentlemen, the question before us is defining an educated person. In fact, I will suggest to you that perhaps it is more important to create educated people. And I would like to make 3 points in my very brief remarks. I want to say a few words about an educated person from the point of view of higher education, from the point of view of liberal education. And I will also suggest to you that that may not be the most important question for us to consider at this point. Secondly, I'd like to go back to something that an Eton master, Eton, the private school in Britain, said 161 years ago that expresses some of my doubts about the issue of attempting to define an educated person. And finally, I want to say a few words about the task ahead of us, because it seems to me that it's already been referred to at an earlier panel. We know a great deal more about how people learn. Cognitive research has been extremely productive, I think, in the last 20 or 30 years. And the point is, how does that change what, at least I used to think a good many years ago? So let me start with the first point. 25 years ago, I was engaged in moving a cemetery. Somebody suggested to you that that is the definition of curricular reform. And in that connection, I gave a lot of thought to the issue of how do we define a liberally educated person, because after all, that's what it was all about. And I suggested that a liberally educated person could be described in terms of having 5 characteristics. First, I said a person of a liberal education had the ability to communicate with precision, cogency, and force. I had in mind oral communication, written communication, what today often is called critical thinking. Secondly, I suggested that an educated person had to have critical appreciation and informed acquaintance. Those 2 terms are important, not in depth, but critical appreciation and informed acquaintance with how we gain knowledge of our universe and ourselves. And how do we do that? Well, scientists do it by using mathematical and experimental methods. Social scientists use historical and quantitative methods. And in literature and in the humanities more generally, we study great traditions, some of the great achievements of the past. And it seemed to me that an educated person had to have acquaintance with the way in which we approach knowledge in all these different dimensions. I also thought, thirdly, that an educated person could not be ignorant of other cultures and other times. It's already been referred to here earlier, an understanding of the multicultural world in the way in which we live. And fourthly, of course, also referred to in the previous panel, I felt that an educated person had to have had a serious encounter, systematic thinking about moral and ethical problems. And finally, the fifth point was you also had to have learning in some depth, in something. I have to say that my effort in this regard did not by any means meet with universal approval. Because one trouble is that definitions of this kind are very numerous. To many people, I seem not only old, but also old-fashioned, because I emphasized, in a sense, the thinking, the kind of thinking that comes up in standard and traditional disciplines. Some people feel that an educated person has to have a strong backing in Western tradition or in some other tradition. Some people believed that it's all about great books. Somebody, a distinguished critic, accused me of not sweating the books. That's true. I didn't sweat the books. And in fact, I once infamously replied to, somebody asked me, can you graduate from Harvard without reading Shakespeare? I said, yes, but you cannot graduate from Harvard without studying great literature under critical, knowledgeable professors. I think that is the point. So there we are, sort of this, I suggested this definition, but I always felt uneasy about it, precisely because I could see that there were a lot of other definitions that made sense to me. And then I ran across a speech that was given by Master Corey at Eton in 1861. And I want to read to you a very brief paragraph from what he said, because in many ways it seems to me to encompass liberal education in an excellent way, and also relates to some of the issues that were raised in the earlier panel this afternoon. This is what Master Corey said. You go to a great school not for knowledge so much as for arts and habits, for the habit of attention, for the art of expression, for the art of assuming at a moment's notice a new intellectual posture, for the art of entering quickly into another person's thought, for the habit of submitting to censure and refutation, for the art of indicating assent or dissent in graduated terms. What a wonderful phrase this is. Indicating assent or dissent in graduated terms, for the habit of regarding minute points of accuracy, for the habit of working out what is possible in a given time, for taste, for discrimination, for mental courage and mental soberness. Above all, you go to a great school for self-knowledge. Well, if we could achieve that standard with our students, no matter what the specific definition we adopt, we will have really accomplished that which we should accomplish. Now, the question is, can we bridge what sort of Master Corey said 160 years ago and the various definitions that we have? And I think there is something, when I said that I changed my mind, there is something that I can point to that is in fact very important in our future. When I was engaged in curricular form, in debates with faculty and definitions about all these questions, I never paid much attention really to how people learn, to what is now called, what is cognitive research. I thought that people who came to university were adults, and we gave them reading lists, we presented them with information, and they would figure it out. But I think I was actually greatly mistaken. And the name of Derek Bach has already been mentioned. Derek was president while I was dean, and he used to ask me questions like, do seniors reason better than freshmen? I'd say, Derek, come on, this is a university, we're not going to ask questions of this type. And he kept bugging me, and then he started writing books about this subject. And I have to say that he was right, and I was wrong. And I think, in fact, that in recent years, research on these topics has opened up so many possibilities of improving what we do in universities. active learning, problem-oriented, the use of technology, more use of Socratic methods. We know more. We know, in fact, that it works. And so what I'm trying to suggest to you is that we know now how to create educated people. There isn't necessarily one way, but we know how to do it, and I think that is perhaps the most urgent task, is the incorporation, opening ourselves up to innovations of this kind, that is really perhaps the most important task before us at this moment.
Good afternoon. Fernando, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here, and I've been inspired by what I've been hearing and feel a little bit, I'm not sure if I'm able to add any particular about what an educated person is. We've heard very eloquently and many different perspectives on that. The perspective that I really want to focus on is K-12, and just a couple of statistics, being that I'm full of statistics, and here at Harvard, and we talk about higher ed. But what our challenge is in the K-12 world is, how do we make sure that all students who graduate from our high schools, and we have 12 or 13 years to accomplish this, leave school not only able to read, write, do arithmetic, but those other skills as well, as problem solving, critical thinking, empathy, collaboration. Those are the areas that I see is what our role is. And additionally, when we look at nationally, only about 30% of our country completes a college diploma. About 50% of our students go on to some form of post-secondary education, not all of them complete it. So for millions and millions and millions of young adults, 12th grade is the last time that we will have an opportunity to really instill in them the values, the education, and the skills that they will need to be successful in whatever they choose to do. And knowing that in this day and age, a high school diploma is not in and of itself going to prepare our students for really anything. They need to continue their education, whether it's 4-year, 2-year, technical school, a certificate program, an apprenticeship, something. So that, to me, is the goal. Of course, is making sure that they're prepared to continue their education. That, and then as Fernando mentioned earlier, is a challenge in this world of accountability. The No Child Left Behind. Everybody's familiar with No Child Left Behind. A very prescriptive and one-dimensional approach to determining whether a student, a teacher, a school, a state, or a country is being successful. That has, I think, influenced more than anything else what is what is occurring in schools. Some of the skills that Dr. Rosovsky talked about are not assessed. So whether we want to admit it or not, if something is not assessed, then does that become front and center? So what we do is we focus on reading and writing and math. Yes, there are local assessments in other areas, but when we look at the accountability system, the federal accountability system, or our own states, and in Vermont, our own accountability system, it really is talking about a very simplistic and one-dimensional approach to what an educated student looks like or will accomplish during our time. And that's the area that I am a little bit pushing back on, and looking at our own state's accountability about what can we do to have a system that incorporates the skills that they'll need to graduate from school, and again, I'm talking over 12 years, as well as the skills and knowledge and softer skills that students will need to be successful outside of school. That is the challenge, and if you talk to school teachers around the country, particularly public school teachers, they will say that the curriculum is becoming narrow, that we're really focusing on assessment, a single assessment that is saying in an arbitrary fashion that all 10-year-olds will be at a certain place, when we know that developmentally there is a range of what a 10-year-old may be able to do. Some are doing some advanced work, some are doing work that is helping them catch up. But our system is very rigid. In the 3rd grade, you will be here, regardless of where you may have started as a 5-year-old. And we know that children come from an array of backgrounds and experiences. And school can influence that and can impact that, but it takes time. The exciting thing, and just to digress for a second, of the new model that we'll be looking at in the future is a growth model. That if I have started in a particular place, what level of growth have I made? And again, looking at 12 or 13 years to accomplish the goal of making sure that all of our students are prepared to continue their education and are educated in the multiple ways that we are trying to make sure they are. That may make a difference in how we continue. The challenge that I think we all face is whatever will happen with the reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind, or ESEA, and what that will look like. Will that include growth models? And I see Deb as the assistant, working with the federal government now, and a former colleague of mine as a school state officer.
Still colleague.
Still colleagues, yes. But maybe on different sides of the aisle right now. The challenge will be, what will this next version of an accountability look like? Will it be rigid and punitive, which we have right now? And again, nothing against some of the initiatives that our own federal government has taken, but quite often, whether it's Race to the Top, whether it's the school improvement grants, which provide quite a bit of money to schools, really looks at a somewhat punitive model. You have to fire the principal if students haven't reached a certain place. You would maybe close the school, open as a charter school, fire 50% of the teachers. And those were things that I, as a Commissioner of Education in Vermont, chose not to participate. I was unwilling to make some of those decisions, which were based on, again, a very rigid system, as a way of improving education. I think that the accountability is really tied to our students interested in what they're learning. Secretary Revel earlier talked about engagement of students, and interesting that he was talking about career and technical education students who seem to be more engaged in their learning than the students who are in the traditional comprehensive high school. Why is that? Well, because they see a reason for their education. Yes, the reason of learning is important, but they also see the relationship between what they're learning in school right now and what it will mean for them in the future. Not that we are responsible for putting out workers. That's not the role of schools. The role of school is putting out educated adults who will have the capability to continue their education or pursue careers, pursue interests based on what they've learned in school, and that acts as a springboard to future success in whatever they choose to do. So that engagement, the accountability that does not tie student engagement, that does not tie meeting standards, proficiency, and moving away from a Carnegie Union model, moving away from seat time, moving away from, someone mentioned earlier, de Mexico, the memorization of assessments. We have to move away from that. And we know enough now, we know so much today than we did even 10 or 15 years ago about how we learn. The technology is available to provide adaptive assessment tools that will measure students where they are and show growth, instead of these sort of straight across the line assessments that say you've either met the 5th grade standard or 6th grade standard, and if you didn't, then you are a student who is not being successful, without looking at the big picture. So the accountability challenge that we're all facing, and the pressure that politicians face, the pressure that our elected officials, that school folks face, to make sure that there's a quick turnaround. As the former superintendent of Boston mentioned, there are these quick turnarounds. If something doesn't work in a year, let's try something else. If that doesn't work, let's throw money someplace else. It does start to have a overload on our teachers. And I think that our teachers right now are the single most important asset that we have in our schools. And their voice in accountability is not heard. are teacher-made assessments in the classrooms that are tied to the standards, and I hope folks are familiar with the Common Core standards. Why can't that be part of an accountability system? Why can't students' course-taking patterns, which is a much more indicative of student success than we're currently used, be part of accountability? Yes, high school graduation is important, but for example, in Vermont, we have the second highest graduation rate in the country. Now, yes, it's a small state and we're very rural, but we have the same challenges that everyone else has in a obviously much smaller capacity. But is that enough? Is students being able to answer correctly in a test the right way of doing it? Is it more important for students to be able to demonstrate knowledge in a particular area, an interest in a particular area, applied learning, going out of the classroom, receiving credit by doing something that they're interested in? And again, not that they want to, I'm interested in math. What is it that I can do? Well, you could work as a math teacher, you could work as at a lab, you could work in research, you could do a lot of things. But without students having the opportunity to experience that in some capacity while they're still in our K-12 system, continues to have a disconnect between school and what they want to do in the future. So that accountability piece of not having multiple measures takes away, to a certain extent, the teacher's ability to be a teacher, to inspire. Teaching is an art as well as a skill. You can teach folks to be good teachers. And by the way, and nothing against higher ed, but having taken many college classes over the years, there's no better teaching going on right now than what's happening in our public schools. We're getting away from the lecture model. So I think that from a teaching perspective, there's a wonderful opportunity to use their experiences and their assessments to move that accountability system forward. So the graduation rates, I was saying before, in Vermont, we have the second highest graduation rate, but we have one of the lowest continuation rates in the country. So in my mind, we're not being successful. If only about 42% of our students are continuing their education in some capacity, that should be an accountability measure in what we look at as whether a state, a school district, a school is being successful. So graduation rates alone are important, but we also need to see what are the students doing after they leave high school, and are we preparing them for whatever it is that they want to do that a single test and a single assessment cannot do. So the challenges from an accountability perspective will continue, and I think over the next 12 to 18 months, as the reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind legislation, which should have been reauthorized years ago, is going to determine, again, and lead us for the next decade or two of what schools and what educators are doing. And it's too important an issue to continue to have it based on one or two measures that are very narrow in scope. So I think that that's where my concern is, and why we as small states, rural states in the country have been getting together to try to have a greater impact on what occurs at the federal level. What happens in some of these small rural states can lead others. What's happening in urban areas can be applied in rural states. The problem is there's not one size that fits all, which I think is what we are trying to achieve in this country. Tell me what standards you want me to meet, and then let me meet them in a way that makes sense for me. And I have schools of 12 kids. 12 kids. I have high schools of 40 students, 9 through 12, and I have high schools of 1,600 students. What may work in one situation may not be the same thing that works in the other situation, even though I want them all to meet the same standards. And I think that's the challenge that we all have ahead of us. I don't have any answers. I have a lot of ideas, and I'm hoping that the ideas that the practitioners, and it's wonderful to see Deb working now at the Federal Department of Education, because she knows firsthand the issues that we're all dealing with, the issues that you're all dealing with, and that her influence and her experience will help guide and focus us on the right skills, the right knowledge, and look at a broad definition of what an educated student is instead of these single one-dimensional methods.
Thanks. Thanks again. Thank you also, Fernando, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. It's a really important one. And I said when we sat down, I was the thorn between all of the roses here. So I do feel really honored. You know, this whole notion and the question of what is an educated person, I find to be simultaneously heartening and also disheartening. And I say that because I find it really heartening because it causes us to deeply reflect on what's important to us and how we define ourselves as a people. But I find it equally distressing and disheartening because it's a rare conversation, at least in the circles in which I am at, whether I've been at the district level or at the state level and soon to be at the national level. And I don't even know that we've taken it up as state commissioners of education. We don't stop and think about this whole notion of what do we want an educated person to be like, and therefore craft our schools and our systems and our communities around it. So it's really disheartening because people rush out to transform schools and to get the silver bullets, which I'll mention in a bit. But one of the things I have to say on the front end of this is that I've had a very strong bias in my 37 years of education. And that bias happens to be that what we offer to our children every day tells them what it is that we value. So whether it's in a school structure or in a community, it tells our kids what we value. And when you think about just in a school system, in a K-12 setting, or even at the state level, when you start to reduce budgeting and discussions are centered around professional development leaving as a component because it's not important, or the arts get diminished significantly, it tells kids what it is that we value every day. And there was no greater responsibility I ever felt as a district superintendent, and certainly as a state commissioner, in making budget reductions and thinking through what will this tell the future adults, the future citizens who are going to assume responsibilities from our state and federal level. So when I personally think about an educated person, I see it in kind of three big buckets, and I won't get into the attributes because certainly there are very specific ones associated with the buckets. But first of all, I really see a deep understanding of self. And when you think about the world and your place in it, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about who we are and what our passions are and our talents. It's very unfortunate when kids go through a K-12 setting and they don't know what they're passionate about at the end. They know somebody will say to them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I always remember, I taught gifted students for a number of years, and I had a fourth grader once, and somebody had asked her that, and she said she didn't know because she loved dancing and she loved archaeology. And I was thinking, well, there aren't many dancing archaeologists. So, you know, how do you fuse your passions and your interests? But most importantly, how do you discover who they are? Many years ago, I taught with this absolutely fabulous fifth grade English teacher, Lori, and she always did a semester-long unit on Shakespeare with her students. And she did a marvelous job, and the kids just loved the whole program. But one of the days, she was doing this really intensive writing workshop on specific quotes, and of course, "To thine own self be true" was one of the quotes the kids had to reflect upon. And she brought me this paper. I was helping out with the language arts department, and she brought me this paper. She said, "Is this not out of the mouths of babes?" One of the kids pondered over this for 3 days on end, and then he turned in the paper and he said, "I don't know how to answer this because I don't know who I am, so I can't be true to myself." So, no, I thought that was really creative, but that's how we send our kids through school all the time because it's not tested. So we don't understand how to even deal with that. And I have to say, and I'm careful when I say this, but I don't know that we always know who we are as educators either. I don't know what we would go toe-to-toe with. I don't know if we know what line we'd stand at. So if we can't explore who we are in the deepest recesses of our heart, I'm not sure we know how to teach our kids how to do that. The second big bucket I have is the understanding of the world and one's place in it. It was mentioned earlier about understanding of cultures and getting a voice and knowing what you stand for, but how that places itself within other cultures and being sensitive to that. How do you fit into this whole world? How do you assume responsibility for not just your community, but for this broader perspective? And how do you do that across, in a K-12 setting, across a lot of typologies? In Ohio, there was a significant portion of our students who lived in Appalachian region. Southeastern Ohio is very poor. It's part of Appalachia. That was very different from the suburbs around the city of Columbus or the inner city of Cleveland or Toledo or Youngstown. So it's how do you get kids to feel a sense of responsibility when they're all struggling with some very difficult day-to-day issues? Are they going to have food on the table? As a district superintendent, I cringed when that call came at 3 a.m. that there was a snowstorm out. Because if I canceled school, my kids were not eating that day. Because their two sources of meals were breakfast and lunch. And yet we want them to do really well on state assessments. And some of these kids had some really fabulous life skills because they learned how to exist in a system that sometimes had let them down. And the third is a sense of, and this is really important for me, it's a sense of the linkages, particularly in the form of the arts and culture and the knowledge-based structure that connect us across all humanity. Somehow we get through K-12 and oftentimes in higher education, and we believe what we're learning is disconnected from another country or from another people, or even within our own communities through this diversity, that it's just, we're not connected across anything. So one of the things I'm finding, especially approaching a new role, is that when I think about this whole notion of an educated person, for me at the state and federal levels, we should be having conversations, community forums, not just in the K-12 spectrum, but working to define across this continuum of philosophies and visions, what is it that we mean about an educated person? And knowing that this education of any one individual is a total responsibility. It's not just left into a K-12 system. And what's discouraging to me right now is some of the headlines that I see routinely. So think about the headlines you might have seen within the last 6 months. We're going to do battle with the teachers' unions. This is not about transformation, it's about a revolution. This is a fight and only one side is going to win in this. And I'm thinking to myself, how do we come together as a people to educate our citizens when we're fighting over whose fault it is, over whose responsibility it is? And so what I'm finding is that we've become so enamored with silver bullets. And I think the state accountability system is a silver bullet. People feel if we get the measures right, everything else is going to work. Teachers' evaluation systems. If we get the system right, everything else is going to fix itself. Think of how often you've heard about best practices. I cringe at the term. I try really hard to never use best practices anymore because it's best in whose mind? I want to know about promising practices. It works with a specific group of kids, but it may not work in Stowe, Vermont. So we hinge on this best practice, like as long as we adopt that practice, everything else takes care of itself. And the whole notion of inquiry and reflection seems to disappear along the way. So this whole notion of an educated person seems to be stymied by the camps that we've placed ourselves into. And I want to mention a quote, and I know that this person was quoted earlier, Jacob Bernowski, but I love this quote. And he says, "It is important that students bring a certain ragamuffin, barefoot irreverence to their studies. They are not here to worship what is known, but to question it." And if you walk into schools anymore, there isn't necessarily a barefoot irreverence that's going on in this learning culture. Because the culture of the school, and mostly the future of the people in that school, is determining by the test and that one score, that one moment in time. I'll never forget when I was an elementary principal and I was walking down the hallway of our school, and it was the week of the state tests, and one of my students was just crying miserably in the hallway, and he was a really bright student. And I asked him what was wrong, and he said, "The English test was only 90 minutes long. I know more than 90 minutes. And I thought when he gets the score, he's going to say no more than that, whatever the score happened to be. So I really feel like we've narrowed our scope, we've limited our vision. In many ways, we've retarded our progress. So I find that we're creating this limited legacy of shallow policies and dampened visions and mediocre term solutions. Because what does it all come down to? If we truly believe that we need to educate for the future, not for our present, we have to really think about what does that mean? What does a graduate in Vermont or Ohio or Harvard, what does that graduate look like? What kind of people are we asking them to be? And think about this. If you think about your favorite teacher, or you think about a favorite teacher of your child's, rarely when I ask that question does somebody raise their hand and say, "Oh, I just love Mrs. Delisle because she taught me the state's capitals." They talk about the empathy that that teacher had when they went to the soccer game, when they went to their mother's funeral, when they asked how their dad was. That's what they remember. So we need to have those cultures in our schools that nurture those skills that to me are lifelong skills. They're not soft, they don't belong to the 21st century, but they're all about being a people and understanding that we forge the future together, not just alone. So I could go on, but I happen to believe, and I think Armando and I are colleagues in this, that we as leaders of school districts in states, and certainly I will take at the federal level, is that we have a moral and an ethical responsibility to every student in one of our schools, every one of the children. Because I always think of this, if a certain classroom or a certain school is not good enough for my son, it shouldn't be good enough for anyone's son or daughter. So, turn it over. You're welcome.
Well, I find this to be a fascinating conversation. In fact, the question of what constitutes an educated person is in itself a terrific question. And one definition of a terrific question is there are no good answers, right?
Right.
We can debate this for a very, very long time. And in fact, I think we could sit here for a very long time and be hard-pressed to improve upon, I would argue, the definition of Master Corey. So thank you, Henry, for sharing that with us. My comments are going to be more in the nature of observations about this question and how to think about it. One thing that strikes me is that when we think about the educated person, it almost implies a static concept, like one achieves the status of an educated person. And in a time in which knowledge is exploding, one of the things which we need to recognize and understand is perhaps one definition of an educated person is someone who is in fact a perpetual student. That we've taught people to ask good questions, to constantly seek out and understand the world in its complexity as we continue to understand the richness of that complexity at any moment in time. Because if anything, I think back to how we would have thought about what were an interesting set of questions 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Some of those questions are enduring questions, but others have changed and will change in the future, and in ways that I don't think are likely to be predictable. So that's my first observation. The second is, I've been sitting here thinking about what has changed in the world since I began my career as a teacher. I became an assistant professor 35 years ago. And back then, a student could say to their parents that they were going to college to study English, and that, in fact, was a perfectly respectable answer. And today, and I've actually heard a parent articulate this when a student said that they wanted to study English or literature or philosophy. Actually, a parent say to me once that their son was majoring in pre-unemployment. I think as the real cost of education has increased, and has increased dramatically, and admittedly my perspective is that, of somebody who's spent an entire career in higher education. As the real cost of that education has increased, we've had a tendency to view education far more instrumentally today than we did in the past. To see education as purely an investment, purely a means of increasing the present value of our future income stream. And not to see education for all the other things that it provides to each and every one of us, a way of looking at and understanding the world and its complexity and its richness, a way of enhancing our own understanding of who we are and what our role is in the world and is in the broader society. And I think we've lost something as a result of this when we tend to view education in such an instrumental way, to see the role of education as simply preparing students for the workforce. I think for most of us who've devoted our lives to education, while that certainly is an important component of it, I think we see our role as much greater than simply that. I would also like to suggest that traditionally one viewed one of the functions of a liberal education as actually preparing citizens for a democracy. And that's why society had an interest in people being educated. Not simply so that they could earn a job, as important as that is, but so that people could function and exercise their responsibilities as citizens in a democracy. And I think we've also lost some of that as well, to our detriment, I would add. In fact, here I think it's quite ironic that if you take a look at the efforts that we as a nation have expended over the last 10 years or so in trying to make democracy work abroad, we've actually been unwilling to invest much in trying to make democracy work at home here. And I think that is part of the function of education. If you talk to most university leaders about what they think that their schools ought to be doing, many of them will tell you, well, we should be educating leaders, among other things, right? And, you know, I've given speeches like that as well in my prior life. But I've come to think a little bit more that what we really need are not just leaders with the capital L, but we need the kind of leaders that people turn to because they're capable of bringing people together where others only see differences, right? We need leaders, people who can see and recognize opportunity where others only see challenges. We need people who are good at helping to be able to identify resources, and I don't just mean financial resources, but resources of all kinds where others only look at problems and see scarcity. And I think that part of the job of education, part of the job, I would tell you, of higher education, is to educate people who understand that they have a responsibility to do this, and also to try and actually create opportunities where students can hone and develop those types of soft skills. I'm struck by the fact that in my travels when I've met with different people and I talk to them about the state of the world or the state of society, I have yet to meet anybody who has ever thought that the world that we live in today is perfect. This is not a political statement, because I find that conservatives are just as frustrated as liberals about the state of the world. And you will find that libertarians are even more frustrated at times. But what's interesting to me is that if people think the world is not perfect, then I think our responsibility as educators is also to instill in the educated person a sense of responsibility on their own that they have some obligation to try and actually repair it. That it's not going to fix itself. That with education comes responsibility, and it is a responsibility to try and work to make things a little bit better, even though we may not share necessarily a view of what constitutes better. That's also part, I would argue, of what it means to be an educated person, is to be able to understand and appreciate the differences in perspective on what constitutes better outcomes for society. So let me stop there. We could go on for a lot longer, but I think all of us have stirred the pot a little bit, and it will be interesting to see what the conversation brings. So let me stop.
Very much for these initial provocations. I'm now going to ask Robert and Diane, two advanced leadership fellows, to share your thoughts on what are your takeaways from this talk, from these presentations in terms of the leadership gaps that you see, and how do you think those can be bridged by advanced leaders? So, Diane, can you please give her the microphone?
So first of all, thank you to the panelists for your comments. It is a daunting task, and we all value the work that you've done to get us to this point. But the big challenge is how do we improve upon the system? And so when I looked at the title of this talk, Defining the Educated Person, I have to confess, I thought of the definition of pornography. You kind of know it when you see it. And the definition of an educated person, you probably kind of know him or her when you see him or her. You've done a better job than I did initially in trying to put some more qualifications around that. But the urgent task is to open up to innovation. I agree. That was one of my takeaways, and to hear it from you and all of your experience was very heartwarming. And then the higher ed perspective, the state and federal, K through 12 perspective, the federal level, and the barefoot irreverence were also things that I took away. I'm not sure why 20% of the time children spend in classroom. The classroom and the teachers and the administrators bear 120% of the fault of not accomplishing all the daunting goals. That was another takeaway I took from the previous session. Not sure why. All the things that we've pushed on the system, the moral, job training, moral, ethical, sense of self, all that we've added, we have taken very little responsibility away from the teachers in the classroom. Not sure why as a parent, a voter, a citizen, I haven't worked more at that. And again, not sure why the failure is all on the shoulders of the schools for all the children, especially the malnourished and those at risk. So it's hard. What I've heard the task from your perspective is to instill joy in learning. To instill joy in learning in the teachers, too, and the administrators. I remember that. I'm not that old, but I remember loving to learn. And I learned in a rural setting, a very rural setting. And then to instill inspiration and hope, creativity and curiosity, not facts and figures. And I heard loud and clear the No Child Left Behind false. And again, as a voter and a citizen, I take that away. So my ALI takeaways, the tone is set from the top. I think you, Deborah, talked about the infighting, the teachers and administrators, and the parents politicizing the issue and my issue. As ALI, some of us are from this country, not all of us, but I think one of my takeaways is to make sure that I, as a citizen, go to town meeting, go to school board, become more active. Even if the education isn't my project, I am well aware now of my role and responsibility as a follower, as a voter, as a consumer. As a person, a citizen. And then what do we bring as ALI fellows to this issue? Some of us will take up education, many of us, I think several of us will take up education as a project. But the rest of us, that barefoot irreverence is probably how we got to where we are as leaders in our careers. And we are learning to be better social innovators in past, again, due to that irreverence, and I think almost to a person because of the quality of the education and the inspiration we receive from our teachers. One last challenge to all of us. If the most educated among us, including obviously the panelists and the people you work with, haven't addressed this in a meaningful way, how can we do that? So,
thank you very much, Dan. Where's Robert? Oh. Mm-hmm. I don't think your mic is on, Robert.
My background's from working in global markets for many years, and the demographics of looking at the demographics today with the urbanization that's going on in the world is dramatic. And when I see the needs in these cities for social order and social cohesion and leadership and creativity, I really look at my own country and look at how we went through the urbanization process and drew on the education that was going on in our grammar schools and high schools 100 years ago in rural areas and in cities. And it's part of what made the country successful. And we read these statistics about the US education system not being so good anymore, kind of being in the middle of the pack, but I really, I have friends who have kids in Korea and in Shanghai and Germany, and who have sent their kids to international schools in these cities or to school in the US, who value the creativity and, like you say, the openness and the carefree atmosphere of American schools and what they bring to education. And I really think that, yes, we've done a poor job in some of our urban schools and in some of the schools with lower income people. But I think we've also done great things in our education system, and I'm sure that you know about them. So I guess I don't have an ALI takeaway as much as an ALI question. What is it, especially in K through 12, what are we doing that's really great today? And is it related to technology? And how applicable is it to the lower income schools or to the urban schools? And is it being done there too?
Thank you so much, Robert. So why don't I now give an opportunity to the speakers to address one another. If I reflect on your conversations, there is, in several of you, this aspiration, this longing for a humanist version of education. I guess the master at Eton, and it's also very much a view for what educating for democracy is. But there is also an awareness that it's an old concept that John Dewey put forth, which is that how we teach is in the end what we teach. That questions of means sometimes get in the way, whether those are how we assess education, whether they are how we actually teach in the university. So how do we solve that? If we understand the problem, how do we produce a better alignment between an expanded set of aspirations for our schools to educate citizens, and whether it's integrating cognitive sciences at the college level to do a better job at that, or whether it is rebalancing the work of schools in terms of subjects, in terms of creating opportunities for every student to discover their passion and so on. What are the kinds of immediate steps that we could take up to do that? And I'd like to invite you to talk about the connections between higher education and K through 12. After all, universities built on what high schools have done, and in the past, those collaborations, those bridges, have produced very fruitful results. I can think about the Sputnik era, when universities took responsibility for the improvement of particularly science at the K through 12 level. So why don't we take another round, whoever wants to go first, let's not follow any particular order, and have you talk to one another.
One thing that strikes me is that boundaries between all institutions are becoming more porous. So I would argue that the boundary between K through 12 and higher education is becoming more porous. Technology is enabling that. You see that a number of institutions that have put their curriculum up on the web and made it available to many others, engaging students from literally around the world in a common set of questions and conversations. Most recently, we see efforts to provide massively open online courses directly to students without boundaries as to where students are taking those. So I think that what we're going to see over time is we're going to see sort of the opening up of the educational sort of commons even far more broadly, and a blurring of the boundaries, both geographic as well as hierarchical, so that talented students will in fact be capable of being more educational entrepreneurs for themselves and going where they need to go to find interesting questions, to be challenged, and to engage other students and other teachers. That's a thought.
Just, I can't, I don't want to address specifically the issue of K through 12 and higher education, but I'd like to ask a question. Larry mentioned that how things have changed since he started. And we live in the most, I think, revolutionary period probably that the world has ever seen. I mean, if you lived through the Industrial Revolution, you wouldn't know what was happening, right? And yet, in my lifetime, books may disappear, newspapers are disappearing, everything is online. I mean, it's just an absolutely revolutionary period. And in such a situation, I start to worry about what should not change, because everything seems to be up for grabs now. Universities, we are too expensive, we are irrelevant, I don't know, just go, we have tenure, everything somehow is frequently criticized. Same is true in schools. But in a situation like this, you have to ask yourself, what is it What should not change? I have asked many people that question, and I find it very difficult to get any answers. I'll give you one answer that is the best, I think, that I have been able to come up with, and that is meaningful human contact. I mean, you sort of have the feeling that if things go the way they continue, you know, we'll all be sitting in front of a screen. I could give other examples, but I'm just curious whether that's a question that any of you worry about.
I worry about that immensely, and that was the first thing that jumped into my mind. For me, I think the teaching learning process, no matter what level it is a social interaction. And I also think of leadership as being a relationship piece. And so when I think about courses that kids could take online, I don't know that, I don't want those to disappear. I think a blended learning environment is really critical, but I really worry if we get into a total technology type of driven instruction that kids will lose that connection with one another, the ability to think through, how did you get that? I know, I may be archaic when I say this, but I function a lot now with conference calls, and I absolutely have grown to dislike them. I'm a person you could see everything on my face, and I want to see somebody in a room who's rolling their eyeballs when I'm saying something, or you could just tell from the body language that I've said a word that struck a chord with them, so I could fix it right then or clarify it. And I just get a lot from that interaction. And I worry about that. Years ago in a school district I was in, we had a very large set of AP courses kids could take, and we were in a budget crunch. And each of the courses, each section we offered cost about $16,000 at that time over the course of the year. And so we had one, it was AP BC Calculus, that had gone down to about 8 kids. And of course people would say, well, what are you running the class with? So we went to an online program. The kids revolted. They didn't mind the online. What they wanted to get from their fellow students was, what were you thinking when you got that answer? How did you approach the solution? Or what were you thinking about with that? So in the end, it cost us more because we ended up having to bring the teacher back to facilitate the conversation among the kids. And then the following year, we ended up having a teacher, it was in the Cleveland area, we had a professor from Case who came and co-taught this math class with the AP teacher. And at the end, I said, what did you learn? Was this really a good experience? And he said, the college professor said, this was awesome. He said, because now I'm teaching 17-year-olds, and it suddenly registered with me that when I got freshmen, I was thinking of them like I think of my graduate students, because they were all on university campus. He said, so now I'm going to orient myself differently to kids who enter freshman year. And then, of course, the high school teacher knew then and understood what that college professor needed from those math students as they matriculated into a university. And I thought, what a rich experience, but how little I can tell you in examples how few times that happens. And it kind of goes to the question that was asked earlier from the fellow, which is, I see a lot of pockets of excellence across the United States. But my big issue is that we don't support those enough to scale up those methods or those initiatives so that they're more common than they are uncommon. And so even the partnerships, as the state commissioner, we worked with the higher ed folks, and somebody oversaw it in Ohio. There's a chancellor over the Board of Regents in the higher education institutions. Well, we would meet like once or twice a month with the deans. And at the beginning, I thought, aren't we all in this together? But it was somewhat of a turf war over what are the incoming freshmen going to do. They wouldn't share their required examinations of students. They wouldn't share those with high school teachers. But they were complaining that too many of our kids need a remediation. I was like, well, can we get the tests? We can't have them. We actually went to a public records request to get some of the tests from the public universities. And yet there were 2 universities I can think of who were just immensely helpful with faculty to do that. And just one other example, and I'll stop talking, but Gordon Gee, who's the president of Ohio State, who I think is, other than with present company excluded, is absolutely one of the best college professors ever I've met. And he actually was thinking about changing tenure at a university. And he thought, so your typical pathway of tenure of publications and grants and awards, et cetera, he wanted to create a second pathway where anybody, not just in the College of Ed, anyone in the university who offered their services to school districts would get credit and be able to go on a tenure track of service. Now that was kind of out of the box thinking. Most of the other university presidents thought that he was just kind of a nut job for thinking about it. But I thought, here's somebody who really is thinking through how do you make this sort of seamless partnership where the transition points are really porous and you don't get into this war of like, well, we're just higher education or we're at the high school level. So I think we've got to think through very strategically about what could break down those barriers and then lift up all those pockets of excellence.
I guess I'll answer both of the questions or both points. One of the I think fears that people have is that technology is going to be taking over. Instead of a human body or a teacher, that kids are going to be going online, doing it electronically. All those things are tools. Those tools are books, those are research. That's whatever it is that we used to do, maybe going to the library, can now happen in someone's laptop in front of them. So to me, they are just tools in an expanding world of opportunities for our students to learn more and be exposed to a world that maybe was not available to them. So I don't fear of books going away or of not having teachers. And ultimately, it's about relationships in the classroom. And relationships is the single most important thing, particularly for our children who are facing challenges. And the relationships of a teacher with a student can't ever be replicated by a machine. And that then goes along with the blurring of the lines. I love the blurring of the lines between K-12 and 13 plus, because that opportunity for a student to take a dual enrollment course, or for a college professor to teach a class, or for a graduate student to come to a school and do something with middle school students, or whatever it is, are the single, is where we're going. And the blurring of the lines needs to occur, and we need to know what they need in the college freshman classes, as well as the college folks need to see exactly what we're expecting of our kids. And I'll stop right here for now.
Yes, but just the one, if I may, on this. Sherry Turkle, right, some of you may have read, wrote a book which I think has the most, in a way, apt and frightening title, Alone Together, which really, I think, illustrates the dilemma that we have. If I go to my old office building now, there's nobody there because the professors are all at home on a computer, and they are alone together. Yes.
I know there's an introduction going to occur soon, but one of the things I really want to add as a huge precautionary thing to this is that my fear with the technology is going to be we're going to create a further digital divide that exists right now, and it's a social equity issue. And the numbers of kids who do not have access even to the internet is absolutely staggering in rural and isolated areas, in the urban centers, kids who don't necessarily have the means to keep up. It's going to become a huge equity issue if that becomes a reliance in terms of a delivery methodology. So that's just really concerning to me.
Henry, you asked what should not change. It's a really good question. I hadn't thought about it before, but one thing which I would...
It's a very important question for you because you're a member of the Harvard Corporation and you are our guarantor of what changes and should not change.
Henry knows this because he was a member of the corporation.
So you feel that weight of responsibility now?
One thing that should not change is the capacity of people to focus on really, really hard problems that do not yield to easy answers. And I worry that technology is so much of a distraction, with something interesting a click away, that people are losing the capacity to really focus. I remember taking a math course in which the instructor, Giancarlo Roda, said what he would teach us all was the meaning of Sitzfleisch, which he defined as the process of sitting for endless hours doing gruesome work. But I would suggest that there are very few really hard, interesting problems in the world that have ever yielded to anything but. And I worry a little bit that students these days are losing that capacity. I don't think that should change, I would tell you.
It's been a wonderful first round, and David, you have come just at the right time. Thank you so much for being here. So we've been in a conversation about how should we define the educated person? How do we think about questions of ends for both K through 12 and universities? And part of what has emerged in the conversation is a fair amount of consensus that schools and universities exist to produce well-rounded people, citizens, leaders, individuals who have a sense of who they are and of how to live for purposes bigger than themselves. But there is somewhat of a disconnect between that vision and the means that we use to deliver that education, whether they are the curriculum, the fragmentation of the curriculum, whether they are about the fact that that question is not often enough asked in policy-making circles or among people who have responsibility to lead our districts. We've talked about these silos between universities and schools, and technology as perhaps something that can bridge those gaps. So why don't we now give you an opportunity to share your thoughts on those questions, and then we can continue that discussion. Is that fair?
Thank you.
Sure.
I apologize for coming on a delayed basis. I was with something called the Women's Leadership Board at the Kennedy School. We just had a long session. And I found when the Women's Leadership Board speaks, you respond. The world has changed in a very good way in that regard. I'm not sure I know. I don't have a sure answer for what constitutes an educated person. I'm tempted to say it's whatever Harvard says an educated person should be. I'm also tempted to go back to the original liberal arts, which served in the West for so many centuries as a core sense of what an educated person should have, and we've gotten away from that, especially in the 19th, but even more so in the 20th centuries. But those liberal arts constituted, I think, a pretty clear sense of what one should understand, and that's very hard today. In terms of where we are, and to join and pick up on the threads of the conversation when I walked in, I find the students do understand, perhaps better than even we appreciate sometimes, the distraction represented by the internet. I had a course this last semester in which I threw in a reading at the last minute about solitude and the importance of solitude for someone to be thinking about the large, hard questions. And I had more response to that article and that discussion than almost anything else I discussed. It was a leadership class at the Kennedy School. People were deeply into that, and many of them said that they needed more of that in their lives. They appreciated that. So I'm a pessimist about what's going on right now, but I'm a long-term optimist, and I'm a short-term pessimist, long-term optimist, and I find that when I talk to some of these students, I become very, very encouraged. And I also think that we should appreciate that, yes, as the research from the woman at MIT has demonstrated, the internet does encourage shallow relationships. Sherry Turkle really changed her mind about the internet. And yes, it produces a lot of distractions. And yes, people feel more isolated, but I do remember, I think, Henry, it was David Reisman who wrote the book about the lonely crowd. And that was long before the internet came in. It had a lot to do with individuals in mass society. And I think that's the nature of mass society, whether you had the internet or not. But I also find that in terms of dealing with some of life's tougher challenges, I had the opportunity to spend time last week at the MIT Media Lab. I should have visited there a long time ago, but I came away encouraged about what could come at the intersection of the internet and other disciplines. And there they even talk about not only multidisciplinary approaches to issues, but they talk about anti-disciplinary, which is almost within a university. You sort of think Susan Hockfield must be tearing her hair at that notion as president of MIT. But there is something to be said for the kind of creativity that comes and the sparking that's going on among the people there who are coming together in almost a playful way, but They don't have big strategic plans. They're sort of doing it spontaneously. They embrace spontaneity. It's part of their ethos. And will that increase the inequality? Yes, but it also holds promise for the developing world. One of the breakthroughs there they have recently is they have developed a very small, it just sort of came spontaneously, a very small little box. It almost looks like you're going to look into an old pair of binoculars that you can attach to an iPhone. And there's an app you can put on the iPhone, and this little box, which sells for a very small amount of money, you can do it, and it does the work of an optometrist. It can read your eyes and tell you what kind of glasses you need. And in many parts of the developing world where people are so poor, but the one thing they do have are iPhones, that could actually be a breakthrough for their health. So I think there are a lot of advantages here that we're still trying to uncover, and a lot of breakthroughs that are coming in these new technologies that is, as distracting as they are, they're like so many other things. They're double-edged swords. And they can be used for ill or for good, and we just simply have to discipline ourselves to figure out how they can, in fact, be turned to good purposes.
Thank you, David. This is very helpful. So we hope you've had enough food for thought. We're now going to give you an opportunity to share your questions, your reflections. We're going to take 3 to 5 and then have another round of conversation with the panelists. Guillermo, please tell us who you are.
Yes, Guillermo Fernandez. I am the CEO of the United States-Mexico Foundation for Science, and I'm going to be speaking tomorrow about education, innovation, and entrepreneurship based on our experiences for many years. But I think that somehow there is the feeling that there is a gap between what business requires and what society requires. That's what I somehow heard from Lawrence Bacow. And my feeling is that this disconnect is not really there. I think if you look to what business really wants, is the kind of responsible people that is going to be looking for what is really important and to find ways to really gather what is needed in order to provide relevant solutions that are also meaningful for society and for the environment. Now, on the other hand, I think what you want from the point of view of a citizen in a democracy is, again, the kind of skills, the kind of attitudes that you want in an innovator or an entrepreneur. You want people that question, that is not worshiping knowledge, that is questioning, that is looking for the essence, is trying to understand, that is looking for meaning, that is looking for ways to find better solutions. So I think these essential elements in the requirements of jobs and what you might call the profile of citizens in a democracy are things that are really very similar. So I don't know, my feeling is that that gap might be more in the sort of general approach to the issue and not in the deepest essence of what the people need to have as competences and attitudes in order to be effective in either of the two conditions.
Thank you, Guillermo. Before you respond, let's get a couple of more questions. Sylvia.
Yes, very quickly, I just wanted to warn.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Sylvia Schmelkes from Mexico City, Universidad Iberoamericana. And I just wanted to warn about this question of speaking about the educated person in singular. Because I think that there are many types of ways of being educated, no? And I think that, for example, a lama that has the possibility to relate to a spiritual being all the time and to meditate is an educated person. And I think that an indigenous person who is able to relate to nature in a different way and to be sustainable is also an educated person. And I would be a little bit worried about the use of the educated person in singular. And well, I guess that's my question.
Thank you, Sylvia. Alain?
Alain Martin, ALI Fellow. I want to follow up on Professor Rosovsky when you were talking about what should not be changed. You mentioned to be meaningful to human contact. I would like to add compassion and caring, because contact is very important, and I think it's necessary but not sufficient. And I want to mention with respect to deep understanding of self-character that Secretary Delisle mentioned, or self-leadership and citizenship. One of the questions about how to assume responsibility when the school system does not introduce role models early in primary education, and when we focus primarily on reading, mathematics, or arithmetics. About 1998, I did a study for Federico Mayor, who was the executive director of the UNESCO, titled Overhauling the UNESCO and Strengthening Its Essence. And I asked at that time to do a survey in many countries about what kind of role model do your pupils in grade 3 to 5 see. And I was flabbergasted to find out, the study is public, I was flabbergasted to find out that in Francophone Africa, out of all places, J.R. Ewing was the most popular character. And I thought, it's shocking, but about 10 years later, I was teaching at the University of Quebec in Canada, and I asked my MSc students, what character do they respect the most? And 25% mentioned The Apprentice. When you know that they all strive on cheating or on contempt for democracy, you wonder why wouldn't we talk about role models very early? Because in Africa they have Mandela, they have Senghor, they had Gandhi, but many children do not know about them in grade 3 to 5.
Thank you, Alain. John, you had a question.
Fernando, thank you. I'm John Taysom. I'm an ALI fellow from 2011 and also a governor of a school in the UK in England. My question really was going back to the comment that several of you made about developing the whole person, about not just education in a narrow sense. And a number of you referred to innovation and the developing role of teaching online. Two of you mentioned Sherry Turkle, and one of the aspects of her work which struck me very significantly is that she has shown that in children, right the way through to late adolescence, their psyche is developing as much online as it is developing offline. In fact, they don't really distinguish between online and offline, it's just the same. Offline is just a punishment. So my question is, in that environment where children are rarely offline, where education is taking place online, and where the psyche is developing probably through until their early 20s, what protections, if any, should there be beyond the existing COPPA Act, which really only protects privacy for children up to the age of 13?
And let's have one last question before we go on. Suwaiba, could I put you on this spot? Because as a member of the Omani Council, Royal Council of Education, where you are discussing a new vision for education, I'm sure that this conversation resonates very much with what you're debating every day. Do you have any question or reflection for the panelists? Tell us who you are.
I'm Thuwaib al-Barwani. I'm the Dean of Education in Oman, Sultan Qaboos University, and I was fortunate and grateful to be here last semester to teach a course at the Graduate School of Education. I'm back for this. I arrived last night, and I'm happy to be here and to share and listen to these very important questions being asked. And I think it's not only you here in the United States or at Harvard that you ask these questions, we also do the same, and we still don't have the answers. But I think I would pick on the issue of what should not change. And I think with us, probably we somehow agree that among the things that we should not change is our values. And I think the human, human part of us should not change, in the sense we have some human values which we must keep. regardless of whether we go technological and how far we go on technology. But there are issues of importance to a human being, like respecting each other, like, you know, and when we see a lot of that is slipping away with the generation, as they call them, the .com generation. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we should be keeping. And I think in our society, we have almost determined that the values and our identity is very important, and we should keep that regardless of what else we do.
Thank you very much. Why don't we give an opportunity for each panel member to share briefly 2 or 3 minutes of reactions to any of the 5 questions or commentaries that you have just heard. Why don't we start with you, David?
No, start down here.
All right.
Okay.
Why don't we start with Henry? Why don't we start with Henry?
That's unfair.
I should say, I think it's the late arrival should
Your
start first.
preeminence, Henry, nothing's unfair with you.
Yes, you know, in listening to this, I come back to an issue that arose during the first panel, but also here, and that's the issue of overload. I guess that my view of, you know, I don't believe that education can solve all problems. I think people go to primary, secondary, tertiary education for a variety of different reasons. But in a way, I'm not surprised that, you know, people in many Nazis had excellent educations. I once actually wrote, and I said, I'm sure that the Japanese pilots who bombed Pearl Harbor had very high SAT scores. You know, I think maybe we should be a little more modest and select our targets more clearly and not have everything take place within schools, you know. What again, I mean, we keep naming various authors. Bob Putnam wrote the book Bowling Alone, you know. I assume he's right. It's probably too much, but this is not all the fault of schools. And I think I would be very satisfied if people who come out of Harvard with what we term a liberal education have, within a rather more modest ways, have learned how to ask questions, how to locate themselves. But I'm not kidding myself that I know that Harvard has graduated a lot of saints and a lot of sinners. And I'm putting this poorly, but I'm just continually, as I listen, I am struck by the problem of this, of overload. There's one more minor point. You know, we talked earlier before you came, David, about what is an educated person. But an educated person is a liberally educated person who goes on, let's say, to professional education is one thing. I think if we talk about an educated person, somebody who, let's say, goes to a vocational school will not have the same intellectual background, but may have, in terms of values, also be an educated person, but there'll be different things. So I think there is no, when we were talking about primary and secondary schools, so many of you emphasized one size does not fit all. That certainly applies to higher education.
Thanks, Henry. Armando.
Well, a couple of things. I do believe that the concern that folks have about certain things shouldn't be lost in schools, and I go into, you know, hundreds of classrooms, if not thousands of classrooms every year. The personal connections, the relationship building, I don't believe is going away. If anything, it's being increased, because we know that our greatest challenge as a public educational system in this country are children who live in poverty. All of the things that we're talking about are important, but that's our single most important issue that when we look at our accountability systems locally or nationally, that achievement gap is where the focus is. That doesn't happen by giving somebody a computer and having them learn it on their own. It happens by having relationships. The teacher, as Deb was saying before, that the teacher who calls home because they knew that the child's parent was ill, or they went to the soccer game, or they show up to a play or a concert or whatever it is that they were doing. Those are so important for kids. I was never a great teacher. At least I don't think I was. But I was great with relationship with kids. And something as simple as a good morning, a hello, quite often for many of our children, that's the only positive thing they see or hear during the day. Deb's concerned about canceling school. I'm on a big issue with not allow teacher strikes. And not because I'm trying to bash unions or anything about collective bargaining, because I also have some things I want to take away from school boards. My concern is that when we have a strike, we have hundreds and thousands of kids who are not getting their breakfast and lunch every day. And that's never discussed. And I think that relationship will never go away. As I do believe tools that we're using today is technology. The tools they were using in the 1920s were something else. The tools they were using in the 1880s. And I think every generation looks at the young people or schools and say, oh, they're not like us. They're not going to succeed. Look, they're not working as hard or whatever. So I do believe that there is the relationship piece and the tools will not take away the teacher or the knowledge that comes from books. And just as a little aside, schools spend a lot of time working on helping children be more humane, be empathetic. Most high schools, or many high schools, have community service requirements. Now people will say, well, if you force a community service, then it's not really sincere. Well, you know what? There are a lot of things that I went into that I wasn't so sincere. And then once I experienced it, it touched my heart. And it changed how I thought about something or how I approached a problem. So I think that occurs. Go into a kindergarten classroom, go into a first grade classroom and see them talking what they call responsive classroom, where children every morning are shaking hands, good morning, how are you, how did your day go, and talking about the important things of what it means to be a human and what it means to be an educated person. So when I listen to all this, sometimes I feel like there's a disconnect, quite honestly, between my world of K-12 world and the world of higher ed, because some of the struggles and some of the challenges that we're facing seem philosophical at this level, where as a principal, as a teacher, as a superintendent, as a support staff, that I've worked on all those areas, that's the piece that it's what's happening in the classroom. And I think, as David said earlier, there's no one answer to what an educated person is. A student who graduates from a technical career center that is an unbelievable welder. And that welding does require physics, and it requires a lot of chemistry, and it requires math. They're an educated person, but maybe different than a student who's here at Harvard, getting a PhD in English literature. So I think not that we shouldn't worry, but I think spend some time in schools, see what's actually going on, talk to teachers. Don't talk to me. I'm a policymaker. I mean, really, but talk to teachers, talk to principals, talk to parents about what they see as the value of their school, the value of their teacher, and what their children are learning. Yes, reading, writing, meeting the standards, no child left behind, all those things are important. But 30 years, when I look back about my education, I don't remember who really taught me how to multiply or who taught me how to conjugate verbs. I remember the connection that they reached out and helped me and provided a helping hand, an ear, or some human connection that made me excel at whatever, or at least try harder, I'm not sure if I excelled, at whatever I was trying to do. Deb.
Thanks. I'm going to really bounce off of really what Armando said and kind of touch base with somebody up here who was talking about role models, et cetera, that were offered to kids. If you think back, one of the first things I said is I have this bias about what we offer to children tells them what it is that we value. If I could take away something in the United States, it would be reality TV. I don't understand why people become infatuated with switching wives, and I have enough trouble with one husband, let alone getting organized with another husband, for gosh sakes. But kids are exposed to that. So I have to really think about, in a K-12 structure of what do we offer to our kids and how do we make it the best time of their life. My husband wrote an article years ago called Why is the Next Grade Level the Most Important? It really ties into things you said, Armando, because the essence of that article was, if you think about it, especially in elementary grades, kids will say, why do we need to learn this? So he said, because you're going to go to fourth grade, you need it in fourth grade, and the fourth grade teachers, you need it in fifth grade. And yet, some of my most precious moments, I came even in middle school, was I taught in Connecticut and then taught in Ohio, and when the first snowfall came, I was armed. I was armed with hot chocolate, and I made sure that as soon as that snowflake fell down, I turned off the lights and we rushed to the window to celebrate the magic of winter and the seasons changing. Maybe that seems a little hokey, but for me and for our kids at that moment in time, it was like, that's what life is about, and those are the moments that you share, and they're not going to be on the state assessment. But I can tell you years later that some of the best kind of things I've gotten back from kids are those kids from that 6th grade who would remember, I do that now with my own son. So it's those life lessons. And when you get kids who think about J.R. Ewing or whatever role models, sometimes you have to take kids where they're at. And if they think that that's their role model, like you go into schools and athletes are their role models so often, they make so much money. Well, athletes are some of the most misbehaved people I've seen. So you can get, I've seen wonderful lessons where people take it in and say, you know, how does this athlete compare to this person, this person, this person? We're some really great politicians or great world leaders. And then kids can understand that there are human qualities, some of which are used in a really good way and others which are not so beneficial to civility. So you try to take kids kind of where they're at. And the one thing I hope that we never lose track of is that one of, I think, our greatest gifts we can give to our children, whether as parents or as educators, is to offer them hope. And so often we don't have kids in our schools sitting with hope. So there are some kids who think from day one, I want to go to Harvard. There are some kids from day one who don't ever even have people around them who say, if you want to go to Harvard, we're going to do everything we can to get you there. And if you don't get into Harvard, or if they don't accept you, too bad for them, because somebody else will really want you. You know, it's that honing up of people, and it takes a lot to do that. When I was in a school district, when you talk about K-12 not just being the only answer, there's a lot of concern about our high school students and their behavior, especially at dismissal time. You just didn't want to be at the intersection of these two streets when the kids got out. We had police cars assembling on all the streets around our high school because this is no joke. The crosswalks were very, very narrow. You could probably fit 2 people across. Well, what group of high school kids is not going to walk 4, 5, 6 across? And in 1 week, there were over 600 jaywalking tickets for those kids. So the community came together, and there was a fight at the end of Friday by the time all these jaywalking tickets were given. So all these community members called, the Cleveland paper's calling me up, like, what about your kids? They're like horrible people kind of thing. I finally just threw up my hands and said, I know our kids, I mean, I love our kids, but I can't do this alone. So we gathered religious leaders and we gathered business owners in the community. We came together under a project that 2 people in the community, a minister and an accountant, headed up, and it was a civility project. But it was all about getting the businesses in town to think differently about our students, for our students to have civility with one another. The merchants got together and awarded, you know, like tickets where you can get $5 off a pizza or something. And kids wore those rubber wristbands that are really popular now for the Civility Project. It was a 2-year-long commitment to civility. They had community forums. It was a very diverse community, so people came to talk about living with neighbors who don't necessarily share the same kind of culture as you. And one of the things we found out at the end of that, the first year, was that people were much more willing in our community to talk about cultural differences and similarities than they were about the poverty issues. It was a big eye-opener for us. So that kind of turned the tide on the conversations that were needed around the socioeconomic elements that really honed in on what was happening within our schools. So just a brief thing, but I think we can't give up on offering our kids hope. And I think everybody owns that. And that comes about with how we interact with our students. I know I turned my philosophy around a lot about the interaction of teachers in a classroom with Richard Elmore's work. And certainly you know Richard Elmore here. And his focus on that relationship between teacher and student can bypass so many other encounters that come into that classroom. So,
thanks, Deborah. Larry.
I've been sitting here reflecting a little bit, David, on why your students reacted as they did to your assignment about solitude. And I think it's because it's really difficult to be an educated person without being contemplative and reflective in certain meaningful ways. And it's increasingly difficult, I think, to find the time to do that, in part because of the changes that technology have brought to us. I was just doing a little list. Henry, you talked about what's gone away, you know, during our lifetime, but also what's happened. We used to send letters, right? And people had the time to think the cycle between when the letter got there and when it got back. Yeah. And then came the overnight letter, you know, FedEx. So you had one day to respond. You know, with the manuscript.
But that was very expensive.
It was very expensive. And then we went to the fax machine, right? And the amount of time to think before responding got shorter. And now we have email, instant messaging, you know, texting. And with each one of these iterations, the amount of time for the thoughtful response has decreased. And I think that throughout our life, we're increasingly hard-pressed to find time for reflection and contemplation. One of my colleagues at Tufts, David Elkin, wrote an interesting book on the hurried child. So this is a problem, you know, for children. It's a problem for all of us as well. I don't have a solution, but my sense is that the world is accelerating. It's not slowing down. And I think if we want people to be educated, we need to find more time and opportunity for reflection and contemplation.
Maybe we need to add a new rule to Emily Post. If I send you an email and you respond in less than 3 days, you haven't given it sufficient thought.
That's good. Or what if you gave a homework?
If you send me back an instant response, you haven't thought about it. I'm not interested.
Why is it?
Or what if you had given your students on the solitude piece a homework assignment which was for 48 hours, you never to check your email, don't pick up your cell phone, you know, check your texting, and just to see how they responded. Someone would have called 911.
They would have gone into withdrawal.
That's right. 911.
They would have had a chemical, physiological reaction.
Why do we use technology that is new technology that is often less efficient than the old one? For example, you talk about email. Can you have lunch on so-and-so? No. And such time. Well, can you do it so that 10 messages? You pick up the telephone, right? You say, Larry, put out your little black book and tell me what's going on, right? I mean,
except none of us have black books anymore.
That's a very big difference between us.
I've had colleagues at Harvard who sit next door to each other, and when they want to talk, they send each other an email. You know, it's like you could just walk sort of a little 5 steps and have a conversation. It's an interesting thing. But this issue of finding time, I think for everyone, you've had these major leadership responsibilities. People are at you all, constantly. And I do know some businesses, some CEOs, they say, okay, I'm going to be on my email at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'll be on at 4 o'clock, and other than that, don't expect me to read anything. I'm just not doing it.
Yeah.
Then it happens to be a better good rule. Let me, if I might just separate out a little bit of K-12 versus the university. It does seem to me that there are somewhat different purposes, and that K-12 has a moral obligation to ensure that every child has an equal shot in life, and that is an overwhelming imperative. That is certainly in this country, but we're seeing it now, this inequality taking hold in every developed and many developing countries. But in this country, where you wind up in life has more to do with the zip code in which you're born than almost anything else. And that is, you're sort of, and the schools have something to do with that. If there's anything we should change, and change radically, it's the state of American K-12. I think that there are some things we should retain, but most of it ought to be, we ought to take off. We need to get really transformative. We ought not to sort of have an evolution in our schools. We need a revolution in our schools in order to achieve that. There is a pernicious myth that children born into poverty can't learn unless both parents sort of fix up their lives, they get back together, and they do all these different things. And if that's the standard, we're going to be generations away from giving children who are living in poor neighborhoods a shot. Armando's right that the question of education among impoverished children is really very central, I think, to that. And many of you, I'm sure, have been into poor areas, and I hope that you've seen in places like Harlem or the South Bronx. If you go there and go to visit some of the schools that are sprouting up, some of the charter schools, and frankly some of the traditional schools, but see what's going on with Harlem Village Academies or see what Jeff Canada is doing, you come away enormously encouraged that if we apply ourselves right and we use different ways of going at this, that children of poverty can learn and they can go on to education, whether they go on to college or become a welder. One of the other aspects of this is to teach all children to respect others no matter where they wind up in life. And the sort of character education I actually think is very, very important as well. But I do think that's a somewhat different role than what universities are, especially the research university, major research university. I think they're our national treasures. And there are many, many things wrong with our research universities, some things that need to be improved. But the truth is that they, in many cases, go back hundreds of years. They're the only institutions in our society which do last. You can't think of any corporations in the top 100 that go back as far as universities do. And that's because they're
Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church, but no corporations. I'm not aware of any for-profit corporation that has succeeded in a way, or at least been as self-sustaining as our universities. And I think they are real stewards. And from my point of view, to educate to have educated graduates, it is important to remember we don't want all of our graduates to be well-rounded. What we want is a well-rounded class of graduates. And that is people who we'd like everybody to have an understanding of and be curious about other realms, but we want to encourage excellence within certain areas that person chooses to be in. That person is not going to be well-rounded, rather that person is going to be an excellent violin player or an excellent chemist, or an excellent this or that. But it's the class itself that should be well-rounded. I don't think every individual should be well-rounded. I think we need to think about educated people and then let them go where they might. My preference would be that kind of approach.
That's wonderful. We have time, and it's a great lead into a next, and that'll be the last round of questions. I'd like to invite our current students or recent graduates to ask questions. And maybe I'd like to invite Alisa Chan, sitting in the back, to ask the first of that last round of questions. Speaking on your point, David, on the potential of children in the inner city, last Friday, we were visited by a group of 15 students from the Airspace High School from the Bronx. They came to visit. These are students who are taking a class on entrepreneurship. They had created businesses. From the benefits that they made, the profits that they made, they save enough to spend a day here in the university. They got up at 2 a.m., got here, and Alisa organized their day. And so that's the reason I'm calling on you, not so much to reflect on that, but because I think that is both a wonderful example of the agency of our students, but also of how building those connections between universities and K-12 benefits all. Those students were on the news last night in New York City. They sent me the clip. And that day, they had the day of their life. They began in a classroom, and they ended having a barbecue with the students at Cabot House at the end of the day. But they also taught us a lot about the potential, the agency of those students in our most needed schools to take charge of their own lives. And so, Alisa, why don't you ask one question, and then we'll take two more, and then we'll give each panelist an opportunity to make closing remarks.
Okay, thank you for the...
Tell us who you are.
So my name's Elisa Chan, and Fernando just informed me that I'll be asking the first question. So thank you for all the speakers. As Fernando mentioned, there was a group from the Bronx Aerospace High School in New York City that came from the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, so that's a nifty program. And I actually just received an email from one of them today thanking us, being very thankful that when they met with the Harvard College students, they were surprised to see students that were similar to them. The teacher mentioned when they came, I think one of the most enriching experiences was not just to listen to the graduate students at the Ed school here, but to meet with the college students, realizing that many are from their own communities. And as David mentioned, you know, you aren't just interested in raising perhaps, you know, an educated graduate, but perhaps a class of educated graduates. Based on just an email that I had received from one of the students, I wonder where you all think our target is for students who are very interested and talented in entrepreneurship. Do we encourage them to remain where they are and say, this is great, you know, you have achieved these skills aside from a lot of students in your own communities, or do we say, great, now you can come to Harvard and become the academics and change that? I just wonder what our, I guess, goal in some ways, if we think that they have achieved a lot in their own communities, do we then bring them out of there and say, you know, come and collaborate and sit with us outside of your communities, or do we say, you know, are they, I guess in some ways I want to know, are they able to have the same opportunities that we think are, you know, the top of their potential if we don't remove them from those communities? If you can speak to what I just mentioned.
Thanks, Elisa. And as you think about your question, can we have a microphone here?
Hi, my name is Maya, and I'm a master's student here in the Mind, Brain, and Education program. And I really liked your point about everything speeding up. I see this happening actually across domains in many different places. I'm not going to give examples, but it seems to be a general trend. And in terms of the goal of school to produce educated people, I'm worried that this is actually related, that where we have standardized tests where the goal is speed, and it's something very easy to measure and very easy, like you were saying, a linear kind of model of growth, to say, well, assuming there's a linear model of growth, well, the speed is probably the faster the better. There's this great study, just very quickly, a great study with kittens, that kittens accomplish the same milestone as a child, but in a matter of weeks, whereas for the child it took a year. And to me what that means is, like, something that makes us human is that we are able to build a much greater foundation. So it's not a matter of how fast can you build a building, it's how strong is that building, and how much of breadth and depth can we get in the individual as well as in the collective, like you were saying. Thanks.
Thank you. Teka, you're one of our recent graduates, and Teka was, until recently, the Undersecretary for Basic Education in the state of Rio, and she's now leading reforms in the municipality of Rio de Janeiro. You get to ask a question.
I mean, first, just a reflection on what we're speaking of when you're talking about 21st century skills, or just basically soft skills that we want our students to learn. I think one of the main challenges to that, at least in the city of Rio and in the state of Rio, has been exactly the reflection that some of you made about the teaching force that we have. So if those teachers didn't have a life project of their own and don't have sort of that, don't sort of represent this educated person that we've been talking about in its fullest sense, how can they instill that on our students, and how do we sort of bridge that gap and get our schools to be systems, or our institutions to be systems that can support that, even if we are lacking some of the human capital necessary to get there.
Thank you. Sergio, you get to ask the last question. Sergio was Minister of Education of Chile, and it was under his tenure that I changed my mind about the potential of technology, because I was invited to visit a series of reforms that his government had implemented, and came down quite skeptical of what technology could do, and actually saw what simple technologies were doing in very high poverty schools, and completely changed my mind. Sergio, you asked the last question.
Thank you, Fernando. At one time in Chile, asking people about what quality was, parents, students, teachers, in a form of citizens panels along the country. So to receive that input and therefore have a better policy. And it came out very frequently that when you asked parents what they wanted, they would say to form good persons. It's not if the guy is better in mathematics or good person. So my question goes on the role of the family. Because if part of what a human being is permanent, and doesn't change much, the love, power, envy, passion, it's a nature of the human being doesn't change as much as technology. And that appears to be coming more from the family. So if the family determines very essential values on this for the formation of a 21st century person, how families must be engaged in a policy for improving the quality of education. In fact, during the whole afternoon, we haven't talked about families.
Thank you, Sergio. So we're going to hear from each one of you, your last words for today. I think it was Larry who said we could spend a very long time discussing the question for today's panel, but we promised we would finish close to 6:15. Why don't we start with you, Deborah?
Because I'm the thorn among all the roses? No.
Because you're the rose.
Boy, finally, we have a rose among
among cactuses.
One of the things I think, and it kind of takes into all of most of the questions that people ask, is just that, you know, the climate and cultures, and I'll speak from a school setting, the climate and cultures of schools is absolutely so critical. But it really ties to the relationship with the families and the community members in there. And I think family engagement is one area in which we have not done the best job possible. And that's a broad brushstroke, but the best job possible. We set up these terms and say we have an open environment, and then we say, well, parent conferences will be held 6 to 8 on Tuesday night. And people can't come, or registration only occurs for these kids at this particular time for kindergarten. So I think it's one that it's really central to what we're talking about in terms of transforming schools, and I think it's something that we have to place a priority on, because we've all said that this can't be done in a K-12 setting alone. It has to engage the community. The other thing I've had to remind myself so many times, you know, I guess we all come with our own set of principles that we learned along the way, or we identify with our own family structures, and I know what my family structure was. Every student I've encountered over 37 years doesn't have that same kind of structure. Some of them don't have families engaged in their lives for a number of reasons. Kids don't get to pick their parents. And so we've got to remember when we're creating that culture within the school family that we're incorporating as many ways as possible people who care for those kids, and we become caretakers of those kids. I know when I sent my son to kindergarten on the very first day, the only thing I wanted, as you said, was not to have him become a great mathematician. I wanted somebody to know him and respect him in a way that gave credence to who he was as a person. And I think we have to adapt that and adopt that within our teacher education programs, within our leadership roles, to understand that when those kids walk through our doors, we're going to treat those kids just as much as we want our kids, just in the way we want our own kids to be treated. And engage families in the best way possible. And it all gets back to what I said before, that we're all caretakers of our children, and we all have to figure out ways within our communities or within our settings to offer all of our children hope. Oh, now you get to let them pick. I don't know, Fernando. Okay, I'm going to pick Armando.
I'll jump in.
I'll
jump in. And a couple of things. And the question that was asked before about whether students should stay in the area that they grew up in or leave, I think is probably the million-dollar question. And many of us I grew up in a very urban, ethnic area, came to this country, left to study, and then went back. To a certain extent, and then moved back to Vermont, unfortunately. But I think there's no right answer to that. But I thought the best part of that little story was the fact that they had role models. They came to Harvard and they were meeting students that were like them, and those are the role models that I think whether it's Patrick Ewing, and yes, he played for the Knicks, so I was a very big Patrick Ewing fan. But when we really look at role models, when I go to schools and I talk to kids about it, 5th graders are role models for 1st graders. 8th graders are role models for 4th graders. Talk to a 7th grader who's looking up at a high school junior or senior with this, you know, sort of awe. So the actions that they see. So that whole issue of role modeling, yes, it's important to have, obviously, role models outside of the environment, and some of the famous people, Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King, others. But they really, what it is for kids, it's the immediacy. I see somebody doing something when I was in high school, and you turn around, climb it over years, and that's by having the students who are coming in see the behaviors and the actions of the older students. They pick up on that. So that whole issue of role modeling, I thought that's the part that I got from that story. And then the last piece, and I'm glad that Sergio brought up something about families, because we really haven't talked about families. And we can point fingers, as people always say, it's the family's the first teacher, of course. But when we have, at least in this country, close to half of our students who are qualified for free or reduced lunch, and that's maybe not called poverty, but who are struggling financially, the schools have to be able to reach out to parents and support them. A single parent who's working 2 jobs that isn't home when their child gets home from school to make sure that they complete their homework or doing whatever's required the next day needs some support. So the school has to help the parent do that. And then, unfortunately, if you look at homework for a socioeconomic perspective, that child shows up to school the next day without doing their homework. Now they can't go out to recess with like all their friends. And after that happens 3 or 4 times, the student there's a shift in the student's perspective of school and of themselves. And teachers, like all of us being human, we start making judgments about folks as well. So how do we engage families who are unable, not that they're unwilling, but unable because of their life circumstances to provide that support that their kids need? You know, one of the things that David mentioned earlier, and that I also talked about, the children who live in poverty. You know, yes, we need to revolutionize our schools, and yes, we need to do all of the things that, you know, every one of us can name half a dozen things. But schools, particularly urban schools that have high poverty, or rural schools, one of the things, if you ever come up to New Hampshire or Vermont or Maine, it's beautiful. Look beyond the tree line. Look behind the kids who are living in trailers. Look at behind where kids are living in places that don't have, you know, running water or other things that quite often, you know, we just assume. But as we drive through the highway and see the beautiful fall colors of northern New England, there are kids there who are struggling. So what schools, I think, really need to broaden their role is become a 12-month a year or 11-month a year. Somebody mentioned before. Actually, it was the secretary from the former superintendent from Massachusetts. We're in an agricultural schedule for schools, 8 to 3, September to June, in a 21st century world that has bypassed that. So can schools stay open till 8 o'clock? So not only are they getting breakfast and lunch, but many kids are getting dinner. Are there opportunities for the parents to come in and also maybe have a meal and work with their students on doing homework? Provide support for parents, whether it's social workers, whatever it is. And I think that's because not all of the kids have the luxury that my son had, to have a family, a mother who could stay at home, of parents who are engaged, involved. Others who want to do that and can't need the support from school. So I think that whole issue of family, it's too simple to say, well, they're the parents and they need to, you know, they're the ones. Well, the parents may have, you know, so many issues to deal with that they can't, even though they may want to. And that's where I think schools, full service schools, there are people who hate that statement, but those aren't the folks who are working with children who live in poverty. Those aren't folks who are working with kids and families who really need the support, because that support will hopefully get them to graduate from high school. And God willing, they will also continue their education beyond high school, and they'll be taxpayers. I was just at the Community High School of Vermont last Friday. It's the largest high school in the state. It's a correctional high school. 90% of all the kids there, 23 years old and younger, do not have a high school diploma. Think about, even if we can reduce or increase the number of kids who graduate by 2-3% nationally, what that does from lost revenues that we're paying for incarceration, lost taxes that are being paid, that are not being paid by those folks, and what it does to their families, their children, their wives, their husbands, their parents. And to break that cycle, we need to really make a commitment. And it's not a liberal, ultra-liberal bleeding heart, because I'm not. I'm pragmatist, and I think those are the type of things that folks like yourselves, who are, you know, going to be leaders or are leaders in your community, in your countries, in your areas, can have that voice. Back to somebody who mentioned about going to local board meetings and whatever. That is huge, because whether we have children or not, it's all of our responsibility, because my future and my grandchildren's future depends on millions of other kids being successful as a group. And I think that's one of the things that schools try to do. So anyway, those are just some of my last and final thoughts.
Quickly, because I know we're almost out of time. I think we started this conversation by talking what it means to be an educated person, and that almost invites us to answer the question, well, what should the educated person know? But as I've listened to the conversation that we've had collectively, we've sort of shifted subtly, not to what do we want students to know, but really what do we want students to be? We want them to be wise. We want them to be creative. We want them to be empathetic. We want them to be engaged. And there are many processes by which we can bring students to that state of being. And there's a role for families, and there's a role for teachers, and there's a role for reflection and contemplation.
Terrific. Is it Lisa? Yeah. Coming back to your question, if we truly believe in equality of opportunity, it's essential we offer tickets out to people, young kids who are living in poverty, living in rural areas where they don't have much of a shot in life, where they're living in sort of forgotten places, hidden behind the beauties of Vermont. And my sense is if you offer tickets out, there's a good chance they'll take a ticket back at some point in their lives. There are two ways that universities do that. One is through affirmative action. And we shouldn't be afraid or reluctant to embrace affirmative action. You know, frankly, as a white Southerner growing up in a somewhat rural town, I wouldn't have gotten into Yale where I went had it not been for affirmative action. You know, a lot of whites benefited from this too, not just minorities. And the other is scholarships, and generous scholarships that look out for people who, you know, who have, that may not have the highest SAT scores, but have a lot of promise. You know, Deval Patrick would not be governor of this state were it not for the kind of programs that offered tickets out to him when he was young. And he's given back enormously. Cory Booker would not be the mayor of Newark performing at the high level he is. He went to Stanford to play football and went to school and then came back to live in the projects in Newark. And now is a first-class mayor in Newark. And he wouldn't have chosen that life had he not been given a ticket out. So I can think of many other instances. It's important we do that not only through offering opportunities to come study here over the long term, but frankly, we could use executive education programs in a more creative way on this campus than we do. I've been involved. We started the program for, we call it the Latino Leadership Initiative. And we've raised money at the county school, I help run this program, for young Latinos who are going to predominantly Hispanic colleges and universities. They tend to be down in the Rio Grande, or they tend to be in Southern California or in Southern Florida. And then we bring them here for 10 days. And it's almost a life-changing experience for some of these kids, because Harvard is saying, we appreciate who you are, and we can't do a lot for you, but we want to tell you that you have a lot of promise in life. And they go back into those communities really energized. I think we could be doing more of that and contribute more to the general society.
Henry.
Just one very small point. I think that this discussion illustrates that human relations are equally important at all levels of education. They've been emphasized mostly by the people who spoke about primary and secondary education, but it's exactly the same thing in higher education. You know, the hello, the good morning is just as significant. The last thing I will say is you've all inspired me. And I'm glad to have been a member of this panel. Thank you very much.
So, in closing this panel, let me share a very short story that will pick up on a theme that Larry mentioned. How do you help people become? About 30 years ago, I was a student here, and someone decided that this university was so complicated that they had to invite someone who really understood it to explain it to the students. So they invited Henry, who had just written a book called The Honor of the University and Honors Manual. And I remember that small group, we asked him questions. There are two things stuck in my memory. One is, I was coming from a large public university in Venezuela, the country where I was born, and it struck me that students didn't seem to have enough voice in the governance of these institutions. So I asked Professor Rosovsky about these, and he pondered. He said, well, I am an immigrant to this country. In fact, I'm a refugee. I think democracy is a good and wonderful thing for the country, but in the university it's a little bit different because you and I are not equal. You are here to learn. My job is to make sure that you have learned, and given that we have somewhat different roles, we can't have the same vote. So that was shocking. I have to admit that as my hair has grown wider and Henry's thinner, I've come to appreciate your point of view. But what I truly learned from that story was that here was a very busy professor, a very important professor, who found the time when someone invited him to talk to a group of 25 foreign students and to explain to them this institution, who found the time for that human contact, for that conversation. And I think those are the lessons certainly I remember from my teachers. So I want to thank our panel for having made the time for this conversation with us. I want to thank all of you for your interest and for the time. And I want to invite all of you to come tomorrow at 8 o'clock, where we will have breakfast for you just outside this room, just before we begin our meetings promptly at 8:30. Thank you.